Hello all, today we will be discussing pastoral peoples on the global stage, otherwise known as Chapter 12 in your Strayer Ways of the World book. Basically what this chapter discusses would be pastoral peoples and the nomads at this time, and which we would be covering would, of course we're going to be covering the Xiongnu, the Arab and Turkish nomads, and of course, wait for it, the Mongols. Now, pastoral nomads. Important things to remember is that pastoral nomads were dependent on their horses, camels, goats, sheep, cattle, yaks, reindeer, etc. Basically any animal they had access to them. Why? Because this was their main source of food, shelter, and of their clothes. They migrated along with their animals to be able to live their lives. Where did these societies develop? Well, these societies developed in grasslands of Eurasia and sub-Saharan Africa, desert in Arabia and Sahara, and subarctic regions similar to the Tibetan Plateau. But sadly, not in the Americas. Why? Because the only animal that societies in the Americas had access to was the llama. Pretty sad. Of course, how are you supposed to plow a whole bunch of fields with a llama? Imagine riding a llama into war or herding other llamas. It's insane. Okay. Now, important key characteristics to remember would be that pastoral nomads had deep and cultural connections with agricultural neighbors. Although they had their tensions, they were kind of dependent on them because in case there was ever a natural disaster or climate change, they could always count on their agricultural neighbors to always have a surplus of food. Now, another key characteristic to remember would be that it was very hard to develop nomadic states if you were a pastoral nomad. Or one thing they're remembered for is that they mastered their environments that were considered unsuitable for agriculture. Features of these societies would be that they were generally less productive than agricultural societies. They needed large grazing areas because once they came into one area and after their cattle or their herds had overgrazed, they needed to find somewhere else where they can sustain them. And of course, since they only had enough to sustain themselves, populations were much smaller than in agricultural societies, where there was always a surplus of food and specialization in labor, where other people could spend their time and develop ideas, cultures, anything. Pastoral societies lived generally in encampments of relatives or their friends because they only wanted to sustain themselves or the people they knew. They weren't like the agricultural societies where they got food for everyone. No, they were just independent tribes that usually just looked out for themselves. Now, sometimes clans gathered as a tribe and they absorbed unrelated people. Why? Because it would eventually mean that there would be more people helping out herding or helping maintain their livestock. Compared to other societies and agricultural societies would be that they were more egalitarian than sedentary societies. But one thing to remember would be that they distinguished nobles and commoners. And this eventually would be distinguished through the size of a person's herd. And women, ladies, women in pastoral societies usually had a higher status than in sedentary societies, so you guys had it higher off, which is a plus. But of course, all empires come to an end and becomes the many centuries of patriarchy, sadly. Now, as I stated in the beginning, we were going to talk about three main nomadic empires: the Xiongnu, the Arab Turks, and also the Mongols. Now, the Xiongnu. What makes them important is that mountain warfare made nomadic empires possible for them. The Xiongnu, that came from the north, up here around the time of the Han, they were ruled by a man named Modun. He revolutionized nomadic life. What he did was that he created a more centralized political system with a bunch of hierarchies. He became a divinely sanctioned ruler, and there came a distinction between junior and senior clans that became more important. And these clans, or this empire, similar to other empires like the Chinese, is that they exacted tribute from other nomads, but plot twist, also from China. In the future, the Xiongnu society would eventually become copied by the Mongols and also the Turks. Arabs and the Turks. Between 500 and 1500 CE, nomads made their greatest impact on world history. For example, the Arabs, the Berbers, the Turks, and the Mongols all created largest empires of that millennium. And that's insane to believe, because these people were usually always outnumbered during that time, like the Chinese. The Chinese incredibly outnumbered the Mongol. Yet, these nomadic empires were able to rule and expand. Because of their expansion of these empires, Islam derived from largely nomadic Arabs and were carried by the Turks and spread throughout Asia. Byzantium, Persia, India, and China were all controlled, at least for a time, by formerly nomadic people. We see this in history later on by the Yuan dynasty that was controlled by the Mongols. Bedouin Arabs became effective fighters with development of a good camel saddle, and this began around 500 to 100 BC. And what this did was that it made control of trade routes through Arabia possible. And camel nomads were shock troops of Islamic expansion. Nomads that traveled by camel greatly spread Islam, especially in the harsh terrains in the Middle East. Now, in reference to Turkic-speaking nomads, their homeland originated in Mongolia and in southern Siberia. And we would see that here, up in this region. Over time, they gradually expanded southward and westward, eventually taking over most parts of Asia. What happened was that they lived a series of short-lived nomadic empires through about 400 centuries and spread Turkic language and culture all over Inner Asia and beyond. Now, Turkish conversion to Islam began between the 10th and the 14th centuries, and in between the 11th and 12th centuries, the Seljuk Empire, the Turks began to claim the Muslim title of Sultan, which was basically kind of like an empire. And what happened was that they exercised real power, and they carried Islam to India and Anatolia and far beyond, and they eventually spread it far beyond. The Maasai. Now, everything what we know from the Maasai we have obtained after 1500. In regard to the Maasai, no large states or chiefdoms, pastoral or agricultural, developed here in what is now Kenya and Tanzania. And here we see Kenya and Tanzania, which is just a small sliver of Africa. And the Maasai had been partly agricultural before in the 18th and 19th centuries, but afterwards, several groups returned to agriculture around and after the 19th centuries between. Now, the Maasai were dependent on their hunters and farmers. The Maasai would admit outsiders into their society. And why? Because, of course, since they live in Africa and, of course, they depend on hunters and farmers, the more people they have to help, the better. Now, during times of drought or disease, the Maasai might take refuge with hunters or farmers from nearby areas, because that way they would also have excess food in which they could access and stay alive to survive. Now, farmers adopted elements of Maasai culture and military. Yes, we finally came to it, the Mongols. Now, the Mongols formed the greatest land-based empire in history following their breakout from Mongolia in the 13th century. They just broke out, and look how much they already gained in land and territory. They completely took over China, and this was in the same century, and they spread all the way close to the Mediterranean, into the Mediterranean, and all of this land was conquered in the same century, from the Mediterranean to Greek city-states, all the way to the coast of East Asia. Now, what they did, though, is that the extensive linkage of nomads of inner Eurasian steppes with agricultural civilizations. And what this means was that because of the Mongols, all the other nomads in northern Asia were eventually all linked together with agricultural civilizations in other areas through trade. Now, the Mongols created far greater contact between Europe, China, and Islamic world than ever before, and this was done through the Silk trade and just trade in general, because the Mongols provided protection, because nobody wants to mess with the Mongols, and nobody would try. Now, the total Mongol population was only about 700,000, and this is just insane, because before the Yuan dynasty, which would be the Sung, China was filled with a whole lot more. China was filled with a whole lot more people, and they completely outnumbered the Mongols, yet they still managed somehow to conquer all this territory right here. And although the Mongols conquered all this land in the era it had, it did not have a major cultural impact, and this could be because they didn't force their religions on ruled people, and since they were nomadic empires, they didn't know how to handle agricultural society politics. So what they did was they already used politicians and rulers that were already established there, and they just had them pay taxes, but they just ruled under the Mongol rule, but they kept doing what they did. So they never really spread their culture onto the world. Rise of the Mongol Empire. The rise of the Mongol Empire all started with this man right here, Temujin. Surprisingly, though, however, is also this man, and you can see key differences from the time. How in the time of Temujin, they have him represented here as a person with a strong face and wise. Yet here they have him bigger. Yet here they have him more healthy looking, and looks kind of puppyish to me, to be honest. And doesn't look like he was the type of person that would ravage civilizations. It's a huge difference. But going back to the rise of the Mongol Empire, the Mongols before Temujin were basically a bunch of unstable collections of tribes and clans. Now what caused them to rise was that before he turned 10, His father was murdered for power, and after he and his mother were deserted by his clan and were left to fend for themselves. Now, when he grew up, he drew together a small following of friends and allies with powerful leaders, and what they did was they went back. For one, they killed the man who killed the father, and he killed his clan, and just from there, he began to conquer everyone and everything, to be honest. During his rule, there were a bunch of shifting series of alliances, betrayals, and military victories that all led to his advantage of defeating the surrounding nomads. And because of this, he won a reputation as a great leader. And in the Mongol tribal assembly in 1206, they recognized him as Genghis Khan, or universal leader. And then later on, he began expansion to hold his followers to his power. Like I said, to hold his followers together, he began his expansion and began a major attack on China in 1209. And what this led to was a 50-year-old Mongol war. And yes, a 50-year-old war of everyone against the Mongols, the unstoppable force. They created an empire that included China, Korea, Central Asia, Russia, the Middle East, and even parts of Eastern Europe. And these setbacks marked outer limits of the Mongol Empire. Okay, the Mongol movement. Well, the Mongol Empire grew similar to Rome without any blueprints or grand scheme. It just happened. By the time of his death, Temujin saw conquest as a mission to unite the whole world. And it makes sense because, you're gonna die, might as well take it all. Now, Mongols were vastly outnumbered by their enemies. Like I stated earlier, they were completely outnumbered, and it's just insane to comprehend that they were able to do this. So, you ever think that you can't do something? Remember, the Mongols could. You can too. That should be our motto for people taking AP World History. The Mongols could. We could too. I call dibs. Anyways, now, the Mongols, of course, had an extreme reputation for brutality and destructiveness, and also for their ability to mobilize resources, but mostly for their brutality. Now, China and the Mongols. Mongol conquest of China was difficult and took about 78 years to happen. It began in northern China, and it was ruled by the dynasties of nomadic origin at the time that were very vastly destructive. And conquest of southern China, that was ruled by the Sung dynasty at the time, was far less violent. The Mongols, during the Yuan dynasty, unified a divided China, and that made many believe that the Mongols had been granted the mandate of heaven, because of course that makes sense that these barbarians from the north, these brutish people from the north who just terrorize everybody, considered savages, were given the okay from God to rule all of China. That makes sense. But hey, it's happened before with the making up of a dynasty by the Zhao to take the Shang out of power. The Shah. Oh well. Now, one thing to remember was that the Mongols didn't know how to govern an agricultural society, so they had to use Chinese practices. The society was very foreign to them and it was different, so they just used what was already there and used it to their advantage. Now, Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongols, later on descended from Temujin, had a set of ancestral tablets made in Chinese that named his ancestors that they were given Chinese names, just things to make them seem more Chinese. One thing to remember was that the Mongols during this time stopped being nomadic and eventually became more culturalized in the regions they were ruling in. But still, the Mongols were still harsh and exploitive and foreign. By 1368, rebellions had forced the Mongols out of China, as they always do. In China, you always see, in the history of China, it's common to see rebellions forcing out dynasties out of power. Now, in regards to Persia, the conquest of Persia was first led by Genghis Khan from 1219 to maybe 1221, and the second assault was under his grandson Hulagu Khan. And because of in here we see scenes of the battle. We see a man riding a horse with his bow and arrow and we see inner fighting between the Persians and the Mongols. But of course, there was a massive impact of invasion, and it was very destructive. It shook the faith. It made people in Persia and in the Middle East around this area, surrounding area, question their faith, Muslims in particular, asking how these savages, how they could be savaged so badly by these infidels. It's pretty sad. It was so bad it made you question your faith. And this could be compared to some natural disasters like Katrina or Ike that we have experienced in our lifetimes. Now, in 1258, the sacking of Baghdad ended the Abbasid Caliphate. Why? The Mongols. The Mongols. It happens. They destroy everything in their path. It happens. They had profound damage to the Persian and Iraqi agriculture at the time. And there was an increase in wine and silk production because of after Persia was taken over, trade between the ruled Mongol territories had spread goods such as silk and wine. Now, the Mongols transformed far more in Persia than they did in China. Why? Well, this was because the Persians had an extensive use of bureaucracy, and which the Mongols eventually took into account, and Ghazan tried to repair some of their earlier damage. The first Mongol in history with a heart. You could say that. But moreover, Mongols in Persia converted to Islam on a large scale because it was the main faith and they were always living there. And this is similar to how people selling goods on the Silk Roads converted to Islam. Same thing with the Mongols when they opened them up. Now, Mongol elites learned some Persian, which was a big advancement because the Mongols usually didn't have higher learning power, but after they had basically conquered all the territory, wasn't much to do now except maintain their territory. And with this, eventually some Mongols took up agriculture, which led to the collapse of the 1330s. And the Mongols were assimilated into society, not driven out. That's the key point to remember. The reason that the Mongol dynasty collapsed was that it assimilated into cultures that it was already ruling over, not because it was driven out. Now, in terms with Russia, between 1237 and 1240, there was a large devastation of Russia caused by the Mongols. Now, at this time, Russia was a number of independent principalities and they couldn't unite against the Mongol threat, not how Greece did against the Persians in the Persian Wars. It just didn't happen for the Russians. In these cities, Widespread slaughter and deportation of skilled workers into areas that were needed were taking place. Now, Russia was integrated into the Mongol Empire as the Kipchak Khanate, or what the Russians called the Khanate of the Golden Horde. But one thing to remember is that the Mongols didn't occupy Russia. They just conquered it and they got out. But the Mongols didn't occupy Russia. They just conquered it and they moved on to the next society, on to the next one. Now, some Russian princes and the Russian Orthodox Church flourished because of this, and Moscow became primary tribute collector for the Mongols. And this gave Moscow a leading role in the 15th century. Now, Mongol rulers of Russia were far less assimilated or influenced because the Mongols weren't as accustomed to the conditions in Russia. You could say that since they already had taken over the land and they knew they could again, they didn't really have to stay because it was far from home. Now, Mongol rulers of Russia were far less assimilated or influenced and were gradually Islamicized as compared to other, and this is similar to the Silk Roads, how through contact with other cultures they began to change and assimilate. Now, Russian princes adopted Mongol weapons, diplomatic rituals, court practices, and tax systems, and also the military draft. And you can still see some of this in Russian society today. Now, Moscow became the core of a new Russian state, and what happened was that they also used the Mongol mounted courier service, which is basically like a UPS, similar back then to the Royal Road in Persia. Now, also later on, the Russians broke free of Mongol rule in the end, around 15th century. Now, Eurasian network, world economy. Now, the Mongols produced little or distant from markets and were not active traders, but what they did was that they facilitated and protected merchants along the Silk Roads and they taxed them. And because of them making it safe to travel across Central Asia, many Europeans, like Marco Polo, made the journey across to Asia. Now, the Mongol trading circuit was central to larger Afro-Eurasia commercial networks. And it was basically, you could say, all the center of this, from some of Africa spanning all the way to Europe and Asia. It helped trade between Europe to the east of Asia and to parts of Africa. And the Silk Road span from China to Byzantium. Dwight. Gotta love Dwight. In terms of diplomacy, Mongol encroachment into Eastern Europe led both the Pope and European rulers to dispatch diplomatic missions to the Mongols. And here we see the Mongols fighting some crusaders at the time. And you can tell, although the Christians here have armor and swords, they're gonna die. And one key thing coming back to the idea of diplomacy is that they had no diplomatic or religious consequences. But they did bring back valuable information about the East. And because of the diplomacy, Persian and Chinese courts developed close relationships. In regards to cultural exchange, thousands of craftsmen and educated people were forced to relocate by the Mongols into areas they thought they needed. And the Mongols' religious tolerance and support of merchants drew foreigners from around the eastern part of the hemisphere. And Mongol religious tolerance and support of merchants drew foreigners from around Afro-Eurasia to exchange around Silk Roads, which led to the exchange of their cultures. And the Mongol capital of Karakorum was a cosmopolitan center. Now, the lively exchange of ideas and techniques also happened due to trade. The westward flow of Chinese technology and art, some of these examples would be painting, printing, gunpowder weapons, compass navigation, high temperature furnaces, medical techniques, and other things like movable type printing were spread from China and were spread all the way to Europe and Africa. And because of this, Muslim astronomy also spread to China, and circulation of plants and crops were spread due to herders and pastoralists that were carrying plants and crops from different areas and spreading them around accidentally as they traveled. And because of this, Europe benefited particularly from new contact with Asia because they gained a bunch of information and ideas and technology that just changed the game for them forever. Now, the bubonic plague. The plague, or the pestilence, Black Death, etc., spread across trade routes of the Mongol Empire in the early 14th century. And it probably originated in Central Asia, and it was carried by rodents and transmitted by fleas. Now, the Mongol siege of Kaffa in Crimea, which you should know where is located because of recent events. And in 1346, what the Mongols did was that they catapulted plague-infected corpses into cities and killed everyone in them and just took all their loot. And this is one of the first instances of biochemical warfare. And what this caused was a massive death toll and periodic returns of the plague for centuries. Now, from India and sub-Saharan Africa were much less affected because there wasn't as much trade and it was a distance away from what had happened. Now, the best information about the plague's impact comes from Europe. The plague was described in apocalyptic terms, and Jews were blamed for the plague and many fled to Poland. Although, of course, this wasn't the reason why. And one cause was also the longer-term changes in European society. Now, the plague was a primary reason for the breakdown of the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries. And this was because with population contraction, volume of trade was reduced, so there was less people on the Silk Roads who needed protection and weren't being taxed by the Mongols, so it was basically pretty useless now. And by 1350, the Mongol Empire was in disarray. And within a century, Mongols had lost control of China and Persia and Russia, and the Central Asian trade route largely just closed. One thing to also know is that the disruption of land routes to the east encouraged Europeans to seek trade routes by sea, and European naval technology gave them an advantage in this. Similarly of 16th century Europeans to Mongols, people on the periphery who were economically less developed and forcibly plundered wealthier civilization. And now, in terms of pastoral peoples on the global stage, when going over this chapter, or reviewing the video again, it would be essential to think about, prior to the rise of the Mongols, in what ways had pastoral peoples been significant in world history? Basically, before the Mongols, why were pastoral peoples important? And in what ways did Mongol rule affect Islamic world, China, Russia, and Europe. You should know the immediate and the long term significance of the Mongols in world history and find the views of people on the Mongols and how they changed over time. And that's about it. Thank you.